Peru was one of my favorite countries that I got to visit in my travels over the last year and a half. It was the first country I went to once I got a passport. I had done about 50 states in the United States. I've been through almost all of them at some point or another through my life, but I'd never gone overseas. And so a friend and I decided to go to Peru for a month. And the first thing I noticed is getting off the plane is that they kind of put you right on the runway. You're not really let off in an airport. You don't get an exit terminal. They just kind of dump you out on the on the runway, and you walk over to the terminals. Security is obviously pretty lax. There's not much to worry about. Pick up a little tuk-tuk, or I guess you'd call them I don't know what you'd call them really, a little car, a little three-wheeled motorcycle, and they have all sorts of different versions of them. They have little truck versions, and they have like taxi cab versions, and they have ones for everyday personal use. People are pretty super friendly, and they make their way around pretty easily. It's pretty cheap. I think it was about $1 or $2 to go 10 kilometers from the airport to where I was staying in the hotel, and that was right along the edge of the water in Iquitos. It's a kind of a Spanish, obviously Spanish motif throughout the town. It's pretty small. It's quiet. It's unfortunately very poor, but they stock most things in the stores that you need. People are either busy at work, or some of the older are off fishing or retired. They have a really interesting kind of pace of life, which is if you're working very hard, and if you're not working, well, you're pretty relaxed. But I stayed right on the edge of the Amazon for a couple nights, and this is where the most poor live. These are just barely more than huts on the water's edge, and they use the water for everything, including their bathrooms. So you have to kind of shy away from the water. The locals, the ones that are a little more retired or not working a normal 9-to-5 job, they're women that either run a cart, or they sit there and knit all day enjoying the sunshine, and then they try to sell their scarves and their clothing to people that go by. I was surprised how many companies that have, I don't know, food and snacks and things, so you could still get. It might have not been what we have in America as far as sodas and things like that, but they still had snacks and things like that. The food there was amazing, but the diet that I was on was very bland, because my friend and I were getting ready to head into the forest to go have some ayahuasca, and we were specifically there to do ayahuasca. I had heard about that from Joe Rogan's podcast, and I did some investigating, but more on that later, I guess. The food, the juices, everything was so good. The yolks and the eggs were fluorescent orange. Just by far the most natural, cleanest food is that I've had as far as quality. The coconut, they chop it open right in front of you. Surprisingly, coconuts don't taste like coconut. I always thought they would. They don't taste much like anything until I guess you roast them. But until then, they're pretty plain. And here's the ayahuasca plant that I was going into the jungle for 2 weeks on the Amazon to take part in. And it's a hallucinogen that lets you kind of commune with Mother Nature as it is. So to head out, we piled in this little van, and there were about 10 of us that went out there, and we ended up hiking about, I'd say, 4 or 5 miles through the Amazon to get. So they drove us for quite a while. They must have driven us for, I'd say, an hour and a half out of Iquitos, and then we got to a little drop-off point, and we took our backpacks and we hiked in for about 5 miles or so through muddy jungle and a clear cut that had been cut through the Amazon. And we got to this little opening in the middle of nowhere, and that was the entrance to our camp for the next 2 weeks. And this is where we'd be doing the ayahuasca and be doing meeting up with the shaman that would be showing us the ceremony and letting us contact Mother Earth through taking the drug. There was the main hut where everybody gathered, and then each of us had our small own huts that we would stay in that had mosquito screens on them. And they were quite nicely decorated. We had our own hammocks and beds, although it was very, very warm. It was, I'd say, maybe 90, 95 degrees most days. even if you were in the direct sunshine. If you were out of the direct sunshine, it might have been a little bit cooler, but the humidity was near 100%. It was so bad that if you washed a shirt or you washed your socks in water and hung them up to dry, unless you could find a patch of sunlight somewhere, they would never dry. I would put my clothes out in the sunshine, and when it went to rain, I brought them in from the sun and hung them underneath an overhang. And if I forgot them there, 3 or 4 days later, they'd be as wet or more wet than they were when I hung them there. Nothing evaporates. It's just about 100% humidity all the time. So needless to say, you have to get in the sun to dry out. I met little friends along the way. This little guy, his name was Nunu, and then there was Mojo. They're two wild animals that are from the area, but they stayed near the camp because they know they could get food. They weren't kept in cages, and they were free to come and go as they pleased, and they did very often. They didn't hang out very much, but when they were around, well, they'd like to come and steal almonds, and we'd keep a little bit of food around to keep them coming by. Surprisingly, Mojo, the macaw, they're incredibly mean. They're actually a very mean bird. Nunu, the little monkey, he was very friendly and just as soft and as sweet as could be, much smaller than I expected them to be. But when the two got around each other, Mojo, the macaw, would chase off the little monkey. So macaws, ironically, are a little bit tougher than these monkeys are. If you want to pet him, go ahead and do it again.
You're half-feeding a monkey in the middle of the Amazon.
I know, right?
He's like here looking around and figuring. And a giant, beautiful blue macaw is wildly jealous.
When it was time to do the ayahuasca ceremonies across the couple weeks there, we ended up doing just about 5 sessions of it. And they weren't able to be recorded, so in the meantime, I'm going to just show you some other video that I recorded while I talk about the ayahuasca. So the ayahuasca is a vine, and then there's another plant that you take with it. And the shaman, who is he's an elder who's been taught this by someone above him and someone above him, and it's gone on for generation after generation. As a matter of fact, he had one of his apprentices with him when we did our ceremonies. But it's really interesting because the shaman, apparently they learned about ayahuasca and the other plant. It's an MAOI inhibitor, so it allows you to hallucinate when you take the ayahuasca and this other plant. And they mix it in with tobacco and a bunch of other things, and they put it in a jar, and it ferments. And the shaman, I guess, have learned this as it was taught down, but they also learned about all the plants. And what the shaman said, the way that they learn about what effects plants have on people, is the shaman would go out into the woods and they would do nothing but eat one particular plant for 30 days. And they would learn the effects that it has on their body. And if it was poisonous, they'd know right away not to eat it. But some of the others, they didn't know what it would do right away. And by mixing different plants over thousands of years, this is how they learned how the ayahuasca and how all these medicines interact with each other. And later on, when I'm talking about hiking in the mountains, I'll explain a little bit more about the medicines. But after they create the ayahuasca, we go to a ceremony, and we kind of commune with Mother Nature. In other words, you just quietly contemplate to yourself what you want to learn, what problems you have in your life that you'd like to clear up or get answers for. And then at 8 p.m., you take the ayahuasca and you lay down in a maloca or a hut, and you concentrate and relax. And sometimes it makes you violently ill from both ends of you. Other times it doesn't. For me, it only affected me once out of all the times that I took it. And I didn't have a lot of visions like people do, but I had some where you kind of feel like you're dreaming, but you're awake. And you can pull yourself out of it if you need to use the restroom or something like that. But it's a very interesting experience because it opens up areas of your mind that normally aren't accessible except when you dream. And so it lets you figure out a lot of things that you wouldn't normally be able to figure out. For me, I found it very educational, and it did help me work through some things that I wanted some, I don't know if I'd say advice for, but some guidance for, some things that I wanted to figure out in my own personal life. It helped out quite a bit. It was really, really interesting. I didn't record any of that because, it's quite a very solemn and important ceremony to the shaman and to the Peruvians, and I didn't want to be walking around with a camera filming that stuff. I don't even know if they would have let me. But I had a very interesting visions, and I think it was really neat. And if it's ever something that you've had some curiosity about, if you're going to do it, I'd say get a good shaman and do it in a country where this originated from. I don't know if they did it in any other country other than Peru from shaman, but that's definitely the way you want to do it. And so we did that 5 times, and we fasted. I fasted before and after, and you eat a very plain diet for a couple weeks before doing it. So all in all, a great experience, and I'm really glad it did it. It taught me a lot. And not only that, but I got to see the Amazon. I got to spend time with nature. You don't use bug repellents. You let the mosquitoes bite you, and if you leave them alone, they don't itch. You just don't scratch it for about 5 or 10 minutes, and it doesn't bother you anymore. There's really nothing poisonous or deadly out there. It's really interesting. I even got to go see Amazon Prime, which is Amazon that's never been cut down or never been cleared. We were in a clearing area, but we walked a couple of miles into Amazon Prime, which has never been cleared, and so it's the oldest Amazon there is. Really, really interesting experience, and if you have the chance to do that, I would definitely recommend it. After we hiked back out of the Amazon, got a ride back to Iquitos, and then flew to Lima for 1 day layover. Then we next flew to Cusco. Now, Cusco is almost 12,000 feet in the mountains. It's 11,000 and change up in the mountains, and it's a beautiful city. It's a little bit of a tourist trap, but it's still one that's well worth it. The city itself it's down in the kind of the city proper, the city square. It's modern. They've got banks, they've got ATMs, they've got just about everything you could need as far as shopping goes. They even have your usual fare, McDonald's and Starbucks and things like that. But they have smaller shops, and if you kind of go off the beaten path, you can find the best place to go, which is where we ended up spending most of our time, which is the San Pedro market. Inside here, you can get breakfast, you can get lunch, you can get dinner for about 6 to 8 sols, which is $1 to $2 or euros, for fresh made juice, fresh made food. They'd take the fruits and vegetables right in front of you, cut them up, make them into a very fresh juice. They'd make sandwiches for you, whatever you'd like. And it was all very fresh, and it was all very, very inexpensive, $1 or $2. The McDonald's and other places like that obviously is not something you'd necessarily want to see in a foreign country, and they were also much more expensive, so they weren't really worth seeing. The overall, though, Cusco is a pretty modern city. There's plenty of wonderful foods, and I even got to try something called koi. And koi is a guinea pig, and they grow them extra large, and they remove the internals, and they stuff them with this plant that gives them kind of a very interesting, almost like mint flavor. And yeah, you can dig at it. It's a delicacy. They're usually saved for weddings. But for about 60 sols, which was about, I think at the time, $18 US, I could have one. And I had to try one. I also tried the alpaca. And if you haven't had alpaca, that's also a really interesting meat. And I'd suggest it really depends on how it's prepared, is how it tastes. The dish that I had it in tasted very similar to a very delicate steak. So it was really good. So there's lots to see in Cusco. I mean, they have fountains, they have churches, they have just about anything you could think of. But I would recommend, instead of staying in the city center where all the hotels and the hostels are, is to go 1 or 2 miles down towards San Pedro, and you can get fresh donuts that are made for about I think they were 1 sol, maybe 2 sols, so about 25-30 cents each. Handmade. The food was great. I think I put on 5 pounds. Mount Salcantay. That's probably my favorite part of Peru. It's one of my favorite mountain ranges or areas in the world that I've ever been to. You start out in Cusco, and it's good to stay there for maybe a few days at least to get accustomed to elevation. So you have to get acclimated a little bit. And I actually had some medicine for altitude, but I didn't end up using it. After being at 11,000, almost 12,000 feet for about 5 days before we went up to Salcantay, I was able to adjust pretty well. So we started out. We loaded up on a on a bus with a tour program, and this is something I had purchased ahead of time before I even went, because it's about an 85 or 90 kilometer trek. I'd have to look that up in miles. I think it's about 50 miles, and you do this across the course of 5 or 6 days. And they load you up and they take you up to a mountain trail, and from there you just start hiking. Each day you're doing between 12 and 15, maybe even 18 kilometers. And you hike up through the hills leading on the way up to Mount Salcantay, and you can see that off in the distance as you're going. But you're also following, again, depending on which tour group you use, but you can follow the Inca trails going up through there. So you can follow paved paths that go up and down. They go up about 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters and then come back down on the other side of a hill. And you kind of do this 2 or 3 times a day. So it definitely takes the energy out of you. Out of a group of 12 of us, the 2 guides plus myself and 2 other people. So there are only 3 of us from the group that were able to do this, along with the 2 guides. And they were really awesome. As we were going along, they'd pick plants and explain how this red juice was crushed, and you can use it as sunscreen. And they decorated us up and took pictures of us. And each day we'd hike from about 6 a.m. until close to 5 p.m. And then we'd set up camp for the night. And we got to meet a lot of the locals. It's amazing how many little towns and places that don't have running water without having to walk for it. Or 2 of them didn't even have electricity. And you'd see these families, but they were so content. And one guy would grow coffee beans and bananas, and another one might have chickens and eggs, and another one might maybe has cattle for milk. Only a couple cows, not many, 2 or 3. And they all trade with each other, so they don't even use the currency. They just trade goods, just like you used to way back in the day. And as a matter of fact, some of them don't even speak Spanish. They still speak the Peruvian native tongue. Our guides knew both. They knew Spanish, they knew the Peruvian language, and then of course they spoke English. So they were able to give us a good tour through the area. So for 4 or 5 days, we continued to hike, and slowly we'd see Mount Salcantay coming up off in the distance. Our last day there, we were staying at about, I want to say about 13,500 feet. And it was cold, surprisingly cold. So even though we'd just come out of the Amazon at 90 degrees, and we weren't really that far away, you're so high up in the mountains that the temperature really drops. Here we stayed on a horse ranch, and this was our last day before hiking off to Salcantay, and you could see the peaks in the distance. While we wouldn't be able to go all the way to the summit because obviously you need climbing gear, and I think only a couple of people have done it and survived, we were going up to the base camp, and that was at 15,000 feet or 5,000 meters. It was a really rough climb. I ended up getting food poisoning from something that was prepared on the way. I don't know if I drank some water that wasn't boiled, but I ended up getting very sick. And the guides were really cool because they asked me, like, what was it my stomach? Did I feel nauseated? Was it, the other end? Like, what was my problem? And I told them I was really nauseated and I wasn't able to hold anything down. So one of the guides treks off into the woods, and he comes back, and I was skipping dinner. I hadn't eaten in about 4 days because I was so sick. And he brought back some plants, and he crushed it up and made a tea out of it. And I ended up drinking that. In about 2 hours, I started feeling better. And the next day I was almost right as rain again. So again, those local plants, it's amazing how Peruvians can make their own medicine out of the local fauna, just learning it from generation after generation. From my understanding, a lot of the medicines that we get come from plants in the Amazon, but I don't really know other than what they told me. So we hiked up the last bit until Mount Salcantay, and the view was beautiful. I mean, and it was cold, the air was thin. You could only go about, I'd say, 30 to 50 feet before you have to stop for 10 or 20 seconds to catch your breath. In a video that I recorded just standing there, I really had a hard time catching my breath. You get very lightheaded, and as you climb up to the peak, it almost feels like you're drunk. Over my left shoulder is Salcantay, which is even bigger than the one I'm going to show you, Kiswar, in a moment. Even being here, you can't understand the scale of these mountains. They're epic. Over here is Kiswar, and I mean, they're 20,000 feet high. They're massive. We're going to hike up to Kiswar on this trail behind me. There's a lake up there that I'll show you some photos from, but These babies are big. We're 13,000 change up in the mountains now. These things are at 20,000 feet, and it's beautiful. After we got to the peak, we hiked down the backside, and we came upon a railroad tracks. We followed those tracks for about 8 miles, and we did a couple more Inca trails on the way. And then from there, we hit Machu Picchu. And we went to Machu Picchu very early in the morning to beat the crowds. And we were able to take a lot of photos and really enjoy it. It's surprising how big it is and how much work that the Incans put into all of these trails, thousands of miles of trails and all these buildings. After we wrapped up with that, we headed back to Lima. We hiked out of the mountains. We caught our plane back to Lima. I spent a couple days in Lima learning how to surf. You can get surfing lessons for like 30 sol, which is about $10. So, and then you can rent a board for, I think it's 10 sol, which is $3. So I ended up renting a board and going surfing. The parks there are beautiful. They have so many parks and so many different locations to check out. It's a very modern city. I think the Airbnb that my friend and I got was about $12 or $14 a night, and that included Wi-Fi and a nice TV. And so it was really quite inexpensive. We could have gone to a hostel for about $5 a night, but we wanted just a room to ourselves so we could enjoy a couple beers and go out and see the nightlife and kind of relax and just do our own thing. So all in all, I have to say that Peru has been an amazing surprise for me. Not only is Lima a big, beautiful, modern city, but you also have small, quaint towns. You have, if you go up into the mountains near Cusco and near Salcante, you can meet people that live just about as far away from civilization as you could imagine, with no electricity and not even using money, just trading goods. So it was one of the best trips that I've ever taken. And for my first time out of the country, spending a month abroad in Peru, you could do no better. It's just an awesome place to be. That's going to wrap everything up for this video. I'll do another one. I think my next one I'll do is on Iceland. That probably is like my second or third favorite country, but that was the second country that I visited. And after that, I continued all across the globe until I got to New Zealand. So I'll go over Iceland next, and we'll talk to you real soon. Thanks for joining me.